December 23rd, 1814, and the late afternoon sun cast amber streaks across the dressing room, where Darlena Thelma stood before the floor-length mirror, watching her maid arrange the midnight blue silk gown that hung beside the window, like a question she had already decided not to answer. The dress was beautiful, she had to admit, though beauty had long ceased to be her concern when attending events like tomorrow evening's Christmas ball at Thornhill Manor. At 25, Darlena had carved out a peculiar existence in society's margins. Not quite a spinster, not quite a wallflower, but something far more deliberate. They called her the ice lady behind gloved hands and painted fans, and she had learned to wear the name like armor, cold and impenetrable, keeping the world at a distance where it could do no further damage. Welcome, my beautiful family, to today's story. I'm so grateful you're here with me. If you're new to our community or you've been here from the beginning, I want you to know how much your presence means. We're building something special together, a space where stories of resilience, love, and finding worth in a world that often overlooks us can flourish. We're on a mission to reach 1,000 subscribers, and I truly need your support to make that happen. If this story touches your heart, if these characters speak to something within you, please hit that subscribe button. Share this with someone who needs to hear that they're not broken, just beautifully real. Every single subscriber helps us grow this family, and together we're proving that there's an audience for stories about people who bloom in darkness, who refuse to be invisible, who find love not despite their scars, but because of their authentic courage. Your support means everything. Let's build this community together. Now, let's get into the story. Her fingers trace the edge of her leather-bound sketchbook. Its pages filled with charcoal drawings of places she would never visit and faces she would never know, and she felt a familiar tightness in her chest that accompanied every thought of public gatherings. The scandal that shattered her 3 years ago, the whispered accusations, the broken engagement, the way Thomas Ashford looked at her with pity disguised as regret, had left her with something society could not see but would never let her forget, a wound to her reputation that rendered her toxic to every gentleman who might have once considered her worthy of courtship. The door opened quietly, and her younger cousin Margaret entered, all strawberry blonde ringlets and porcelain optimism, her 21 years of unblemished standing filling the room like candlelight breaking through fog. "Oh, Darlena, have you heard?" she said breathlessly, settling onto the velvet settee. "Lady Catherine says the Duke of Somerton has returned from his travels abroad, and he'll be attending the ball tomorrow evening. Can you imagine? 5 years he's been gone, and now he chooses the Christmas season to reappear." Darlena turned from the mirror, offering Margaret a smile that had become second nature over the years, warm enough to seem genuine, distant enough to protect what remained of her heart. "How wonderful for Lady Catherine's guest list," she replied evenly, "though I suspect one duke matters little when there are so many eager debutantes requiring dance partners." Margaret's face fell slightly, her natural kindness wrestling with her excitement. "You will attend, won't you? I know these events can be difficult for you, but Mother says it would look odd if you stayed away again. People will talk." People always talked, Darlena thought, but did not say aloud. Instead, she moved toward the window where the first snowflakes of winter had begun their slow descent from a pewter sky. The world outside was transforming into something magical, all soft edges and hushed promise, and yet Darlena felt only the cold seeping through the glass, settling into the hollow spaces where hope used to live. "I shall attend," she said quietly, watching her breath fog the window pane. "Someone must keep you from Lord Whitmore's overly enthusiastic waltz attempts." Margaret laughed, the sound like bells, but Darlena had already retreated into that interior silence where she spent most of her days. She would go to the ball, because refusal would create more gossip than attendance. She would wear her blue silk like a uniform. She would find her customary corner in the far alcove near the terrace doors, where the light was dim and the music slightly muffled, and she would open her sketchbook and become what she had perfected, a ghost in a room full of life. She had nearly turned from the window when voices drifted up from the drawing room below, where her aunt was receiving afternoon callers. The window was slightly ajar, and the winter air carried words like daggers wrapped in silk. "Poor Darlena," Lady Isabella Pembroke was saying, her voice dripping with that particular species of cruelty that society women cultivated like hothouse orchids. "It really is quite pathetic how she skulks about these gatherings, isn't it? One almost wonders why her family bothers dragging her along. She'll never dance again, never marry. After what happened with the Ashford boy, well, some reputations simply cannot be mended. She's taking up space that could be occupied by someone who matters." Darlena's hand gripped the window frame until her knuckles went white, her breath catching in her throat like a trapped bird. The snow continued to fall outside, gentle and indifferent, as the words carved themselves into the tender places she had tried so hard to protect. Margaret had gone still on the settee, her face flushed with anger. "Darlena, it's nothing I haven't heard before," Darlena interrupted, her voice steady despite the way her heart hammered against her ribs. She closed the window with deliberate care, shutting out both the cold and the poison. "Lady Isabella enjoys her sport. I've learned not to provide her with the satisfaction of a reaction." But as she turned back to face the room, catching sight of herself in the mirror, her dark hair elegantly arranged, her blue dress waiting like a prisoner's uniform, her brown eyes carefully empty of everything she refused to feel, Darlena knew that Lady Isabella's words had found a mark, as they always did, settling like frost over whatever fragile warmth still lived inside her. The evening before the ball stretched long and uncomfortable, each hour marked by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway outside Darlena's room. She sat in a high-backed chair near her fireplace, her sketchbook open across her lap, but her charcoal remained motionless in her hand. The page was blank, and she felt equally so, a woman-shaped absence, carefully preserved behind walls of ice that she had built stone by frozen stone. She thought briefly of feigning illness, of claiming a headache or a chill that would excuse her from attending. The temptation was so strong she could taste it like bitter medicine on her tongue. But then she remembered Margaret's hopeful face, and the way her aunt had looked at her last week was something uncomfortably close to pity, and she understood that her absence would be noted, discussed, dissected in drawing rooms across the county. She couldn't even face them after all this time. They would say, "How weak?" No, she would attend. She would wear her armor of blue silk and sit in her designated corner, and she would endure whatever fresh humiliation Lady Isabella had prepared, because that was what one did when survival had replaced living as one's primary objective. Outside her window, the snow had accumulated into drift that transformed a familiar garden into something from a fairy story, all pristine whiteness and possibility. Darlena rose from her chair, moving to press her palm against the cold glass, and felt the treacherous stirring of something she had thought long dead. Somewhere deep within her chest, buried beneath 3 years of careful suppression, there lived a longing so fierce it frightened her, a desperate wish to be seen not as the ice lady or the ruined woman, but as herself, to be asked to dance by someone who meant it, to be worthy of something beyond pity and scorn. She pressed both palms flat against her heart as if to smother the feeling, reminding herself sternly that such wishes were not for women like her, women who had stumbled, women who bore invisible wounds that society would never let heal. The fire crackled behind her, and Darlena returned to her chair, opening her sketchbook to a fresh page. Tomorrow she would attend the Christmas ball at Thornhill Manor. She would refuse every invitation to dance, as she always did. She would be invisible, as she had become expert at being. And perhaps, she told herself as she finally began to draw quick, angry strokes that formed the outline of an empty ballroom, perhaps that was for the best. The woman in her sketch looked back at her with something like understanding, and Darlena continued drawing until the candle burned low and the shadows gathered in familiar corners, until the snow stopped falling and silence settled over everything like a benediction or a curse. December 24th, 1814, and the carriage wheels crunched through fresh snow as they approached Thornhill Manor, its windows blazing with candlelight against the winter darkness, like a ship aflame on a black sea. Darlena sat rigid against the velvet cushions, her gloved hands folded precisely in her lap, her blue silk gown arranged with the meticulous care of a soldier checking armor before a battle. Across from her, Margaret chattered nervously about the orchestra and the decorations, but Darlena heard only the roaring in her own ears, the familiar surge of anxiety that preceded every public appearance. The carriage stopped, and a liveried footman opened the door, his face professionally blank as he handed them down. The cold air struck Darlena like a slap, and she drew her cloak tighter, feeling the weight of her sketchbook tucked into her reticule, like a talisman against what was to come. They joined the stream of guests ascending the wide stone steps, and Darlena kept her eyes fixed on the back of the woman ahead of her, counting her breaths, willing herself to become small and unremarkable. The entrance hall was a cathedral of light and sound, hundreds of candles reflected in gilt mirrors, the music from the ballroom beyond already swelling with the opening strains of a country dance. Darlena felt the heat of so many bodies pressed together, smelled the mingled perfumes and pomades, heard the laughter that seemed to echo off the marble floors like accusations. A servant took their cloaks, and suddenly Darlena was exposed in her midnight blue silk, and she felt every eye in the entrance hall turn toward her like compass needles finding north. The whisper started immediately, a rustling susurration that followed her like wine through dead leaves. She caught fragments as she and Margaret moved toward the ballroom. That's the Thelma girl, 3 years and still unmarried. After what happened with Ashford, each phrase a needle slipped between her ribs with surgical precision. Margaret's hand found hers and squeezed, but Darlena had already retreated behind her carefully constructed walls, her face a mask of serene indifference that betrayed nothing of the way her heart hammered against her stays. The ballroom opened before them like the mouth of some glittering beast, all gold leaf and crystal chandeliers, the polished floor reflecting the swirl of dancers in their jewel-toned gowns and severe black evening coats. Darlena paused at the threshold, and for one vertiginous moment she felt the weight of 100 pairs of eyes and felt herself assessed and dismissed in the space of a heartbeat. Lady Isabella stood near the center of the room, resplendent in emerald satin, and when their eyes met across the crowd, the older woman's smile was a blade wrapped in silk. Darlena moved along the perimeter of the room with Margaret, heading toward the alcove near the terrace doors where she had stationed herself at every ball for the past 3 years. It was her sanctuary, dimly lit and partially hidden by a marble column, close enough to observe but far enough to avoid direct engagement. She settled onto the cushioned bench with relief, arranging her skirts with practiced efficiency, and Margaret hovered uncertainly beside her. "You don't have to sit with me," Darlena said gently. "Go find your friends. I'm perfectly content here." Margaret's face showed the war between duty and desire, but youth won out as it always did, and she squeezed Darlena's hand once more before disappearing into the crowd. Darlena watched her go, then reached into her reticule for her sketchbook, opening it to a blank page like opening a door into another world. Around her, the ball roared and glittered, but she was already halfway to invisible, already becoming the ghost she had perfected over countless evenings just like this one. Across the room, she saw Lady Isabella lean toward Mrs. Cavendish, their fans rising to hide their mouths, and both women glanced in her direction with expressions of theatrical pity. Darlena's pencil moved across the page, drawing sharp, angry lines that formed the outline of a bird trapped in a gilded cage, and she did not look up again. Darlena broke eye contact first, her gaze dropping to her sketchbook with the practiced deflection of someone who had learned that sustained attention always preceded pain. Her heart hammered against her ribs in a rhythm that felt dangerous, unfamiliar, and she forced her hand to move across the page with deliberate strokes, pretending an absorption she did not feel. She could still sense him watching her, the weight of his regard like heat from a fire she dared not approach. The reprieve lasted less than a minute before Mr. Edmund Hartley materialized at her elbow, his round face flushed with either courage or champagne, possibly both. He was a third son of a country squire, harmless and forgettable, and he executed a bow that was more enthusiastic than elegant. "Miss Thelma," he said, his voice carrying the forced cheer of someone fulfilling a charitable obligation. "Might I have the honor of the next dance?" Darlena looked up at him with the cool politeness she had perfected over 3 years of such requests. The few that still came from gentlemen either too ignorant of her scandal or too desperate for a partner to care. "You are very kind, Mr. Hartley, but I'm afraid I must decline. I find I am quite content with my sketches this evening." His relief was almost comically visible, a man released from an uncomfortable duty, and he bowed again before retreating with unseemly haste. Darlena returned to her drawing, adding sharp angles to her caged bird's wings. Lord Peter Ashworth approached next, Thomas's younger brother, and Darlena felt her spine stiffen at the sight of him. He had the same weak chin, the same pale blue eyes that had once promised her everything and delivered only humiliation. "Miss Thelma," he began, his voice carrying an edge of something that might have been either pity or spite, "surely you would honor me with one dance? For old time's sake." The cruelty of it took her breath away, the casual wielding of her past pain, as though it were merely an amusing anecdote. Darlena's fingers tightened on her pencil until she felt the wood might snap. "No, Lord Ashworth," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the rage that burned beneath her composure. "I would not." He shrugged, already turning away, and Darlena heard him mutter something to his companion about ice queens and bitter old maids as they walked off laughing. She bent her head over her sketchbook, willing herself not to feel, not to care, but the words had found their mark as they always did, settling like acid in her chest. 2 more gentlemen approached in quick succession, both fulfilling social obligations with transparent reluctance, and Darlena refused them with the same cool courtesy. She had perfected this dance of rejection, had made an art of declining gracefully, of maintaining her dignity, while the world confirmed again and again that she was unwanted, unworthy, untouchable. She was adding the final touches to her drawing, darkening the shadows around her caged bird, when a presence settled into the space beside her bench, too close to ignore, too deliberate to be accidental. She knew without looking that it was him, could feel the change in the air the way animals sense approaching storms. "That a rather melancholy subject for a Christmas ball," Scott Williams said, his voice low and rough with the texture of someone who had forgotten how to make pleasant small talk or had decided such pretenses were no longer worth the effort. Darlena looked up slowly, prepared to deliver another polite refusal, but the words died in her throat. Up close, he was even more unsettling than from across the room, his dark eyes holding hers with a directness that felt almost rude in its intensity. There was no social performance in his face, no careful arrangement of features designed to charm or disarm. He simply looked at her as though she were a puzzle he intended to solve, and for the first time in 3 years, Darlena felt the ice around her heart crack just slightly, a hairline fracture that terrified her more than all of Lady Isabella's barbs combined. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the space beside her on the bench, though he was already settling there with the easy disregard of a man who had stopped asking permission for most things. Darlena found herself nodding, her voice momentarily lost somewhere between surprise and the sudden acute awareness of how close he was, close enough that she could smell the faint scent of sandalwood and something wilder, like wind over open water. Around them, the ballroom's noise seemed to dim and then surge back with renewed intensity. Darlena didn't need to look to know that every eye in the room had found them. that whispers were already spreading like fire through dry grass. The Duke of Somerton, seated beside the ice lady in her shadowed corner, ignoring the line of eager mothers and their daughters who had been positioning themselves for his attention all evening. "Your Grace," Darlena began, her voice steady despite the panic rising in her chest. "I'm certain there are more suitable conversation partners available to you. Lady Ravenscroft has several nieces who would be delighted." "I'm not interested in suitable," Scott interrupted, his attention fixed on her sketchbook. "May I?" She hesitated, then turned the page toward him, feeling strangely vulnerable as he studied her drawing of the caged bird. He was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the easy platitudes she had expected. "You've captured something true here," he said, tracing the air above the darkened bars without touching the page. "Most people draw birds in flight, all freedom and grace. But this understands that captivity isn't always about physical bars." Darlena felt something in her chest tighten and release simultaneously, a sensation so unfamiliar it took her a moment to recognize it as relief, the profound comfort of being understood. "You've been to places where people draw differently," she said, not quite a question. "I've been to places where people have forgotten how to pretend," he replied, leaning back against the wall behind them with an informality that would have scandalized the room if they hadn't already been scandalized by his mere presence beside her. 5 years in monasteries and mountain villages, among people who had no use for titles or social niceties. I thought I was searching for ancient wisdom, but mostly I learned that silence is sometimes the bravest thing a person can offer the world. Darlena looked at him fully then, seeing past the title and the evening clothes to the man who had chosen exile over obligation, who had walked away from everything this ballroom represented in search of something more true. "And yet you came back," she said softly. "Duty called," he said with a slight grimace. "My estate, my tenants, my responsibilities. But I came back different than I left, and I suspect it's going to prove inconvenient for everyone expecting me to slot back into the role I abandoned." Across the room, Lady Isabella's voice rose in theatrical shock, and Darlena saw her fan fluttering like an agitated bird as she spoke to Mrs. Cavendish, both women staring openly in their direction. Scott followed her gaze and then looked back at her with something that might have been amusement. "Does it bother you?" he asked. "The watching? The whispering?" "Every moment of every day," Darlena admitted, surprised by her own honesty. "But I've learned that showing them it bothers me only makes it worse." "Ah," he said, and there was understanding in that single syllable. "So you've built your fortress of ice, and you've become very skilled at defending it." "It's kept me alive," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't doubt it," Scott replied. "But tell me, Miss Thelma, and you may refuse to answer if you wish, does it ever feel like the fortress is also a prison?" The question landed like a blade between her ribs, surgical and precise, cutting through 3 years of carefully constructed defenses to expose a truth she had never spoken aloud. Her hands trembled slightly as she closed her sketchbook, and when she finally met his eyes, she saw no judgment there, only the patient recognition of someone who had built his own fortresses and knew the way to maintaining them. "Every single day," she whispered, and felt another crack spider across the ice around her heart. The orchestra had moved through 3 dances since Scott had settled beside her, and Darlena had become acutely aware that they were creating a spectacle simply by continuing to exist in each other's presence. She watched Margaret glide past in the arms of young Lord Whitmore, her cousin's eyes wide with questions she would surely ask later, and felt the weight of expectation pressing down like a physical force. Scott had been quiet for several minutes, seemingly content to share a corner in comfortable silence, but now he shifted slightly, angling toward her with an intentness that made her breath catch. "Miss Thelma," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear, "would you do me the honor of dancing with me?" The words hung in the air between them like a challenge and an invitation and a question all at once. Darlena felt her entire body go rigid, her hands clutching her sketchbook, so tightly the leather binding creaked in protest. Around them, the ballroom seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her response, waiting for the Ice Lady to deliver another refusal to add to her collection. "No," she said, the word emerging more harshly than she intended. "Thank you, but no." Scott didn't retreat the way the others had, didn't offer a polite bow and escape. Instead, he leaned closer, his dark eyes searching her face with that unsettling directness that seemed to see through every defense she possessed. "Why?" he asked simply. "Because I don't dance," Darlena replied, her voice tight with the effort of maintaining composure. "I haven't danced in 3 years, and I have no intention of starting tonight." "That's not an answer," Scott said gently. "That's a statement of historical fact. I asked you why." Darlena felt something dangerous rising in her chest, a wild thing that had been caged for so long it no longer remembered what freedom tasted like. She wanted to stand, to flee to the terrace where the cold air might shock her back into her carefully maintained numbness. But Scott's presence beside her was somehow both an anchor and a destabilizing force, keeping her rooted while everything inside her threatened to come undone. "Because they're watching," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're always watching, waiting for me to provide them with entertainment, with confirmation of everything they already believe about me." "And what do they believe?" Scott asked, his tone maddeningly patient, as though he had all the time in the world to excavate the truth she had buried beneath years of protective ice. Darlena's laugh was bitter, sharp-edged. "That I'm broken, damaged, that the scandal with Thomas Ashford revealed something fundamental about my character, some moral failing that makes me unworthy of respect or consideration. They watch me the way one watches an injured animal, with a mixture of pity and revulsion, and the secret hope that it might do something interesting before it dies." The words spilled out of her like poison she'd been holding in her mouth for too long, and she felt both relieved and horrified by her own honesty. She had never said these things aloud, had never given voice to the truths that lived in the darkest corners of her heart. Scott was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight that suggested he understood more than she had said. "And if you were to dance," he said slowly, "if you were to step onto that floor with me, what do you imagine would happen?" Darlena closed her eyes, seeing it all with perfect clarity. The whispers rise in audible commentary, Lady Isabella's delighted cruelty, the way every eye would track her movements, waiting for her to stumble, to prove that she was exactly as unworthy as they believed. "I cannot dance while they wait for me to stumble," she said, her voice breaking on the final word. "I cannot be the spectacle they so desperately want me to be. I cannot give them the satisfaction of watching me try and fail to be something I can never be again." "And what is that?" Scott asked quietly. "Worthy," Darlena whispered, and felt the tears she had refused for 3 years finally begin to burn behind her eyes. "Of being seen, of being wanted, of taking up space in a room full of people who matter." Scott's hand moved then, covering hers where it gripped her sketchbook, his touch warm and solid and utterly unexpected. "Miss Thelma," he said, his voice carrying a certainty that felt like an anchor in stormy seas, "I think perhaps it's time we gave them something real to watch." Before Darlena could process his words, Scott stood with the fluid grace of a man who had made far more difficult decisions than this one, and the simple act of him rising seemed to command the attention of the entire ballroom. The music faltered. Conversations died mid-sentence, and even Lady Isabella's fan stilled in her hand as every eye turned to watch the Duke of Somerton standing beside the Ice Lady's corner sanctuary. Scott turned to face the room, and something in his posture shifted, became the bearing of a man who had been born command and had simply chosen not to for 5 years. When he spoke, His voice carried across the vast space with effortless authority, a sound that turned heads and silenced whispers as effectively as a thunderclap. "Clear the hall." The words hung in the sudden silence like a pronouncement from on high. Lord Ravenscroft, who had been standing near the orchestra, looked confused, as though he had misheard. "Your Grace?" he called out uncertainly. "I said clear the hall," Scott repeated, his tone leaving no room for negotiation or clarification. "Everyone, now!" The ballroom erupted into chaos. Lady Isabella's voice rose in shrill protest, demanding to know what nonsense this was, while Mrs. Cavendish clutched her pearls as though they might protect her from whatever madness had seized the Duke. Lord Ravenscroft hurried forward, his face flushed with embarrassment and confusion, attempting to reason with Scott in urgent whispers that Darlena couldn't quite hear from a frozen position on the bench. But Scott's attention never wavered from the assembled guests, his dark eyes sweeping across the crowd with an implacability that made it clear this was not a request subject to debate. "This is my family's estate," he said, his voice cutting to the rising objections like a blade through silk. "And I am asking you all, very politely, to retire to the gardens for the next half hour. The fires have been lit in the outdoor pavilion, and refreshments will be provided, but this ballroom is currently occupied." Darlena felt as though she had forgotten how to breathe, her entire world narrowing to the impossible reality of what was happening. Scott Williams, Duke of Somerton, was clearing an entire Christmas ball of its guests for reasons she couldn't begin to comprehend but suspected, with a terror that felt like hope, might have something to do with her. The guests began to move, propelled by equal parts confusion and the iron will of a duke who clearly would not be swayed. Lady Isabella swept past with her entourage, her face twisted in outrage, pausing only long enough to hiss something venomous in Scott's direction that he ignored with the same ease one might ignore a gnat. Margaret appeared at Darlena's side, her eyes wide with concern and excitement, squeezing Darlena's hand once before being shepherded toward the doors by their aunt. The exodus took less than 10 minutes, though it felt like hours. Servants moved through the room with practiced efficiency, guiding guests toward the terrace doors and the snow-dusted gardens beyond, where the outdoor fires cast dancing shadows against the winter darkness. The orchestra packed their instruments with bewildered haste, the last violin case snapping shut with a sound that echoed to the rapidly emptying space. And then, impossibly, they were alone. The ballroom stretched around them like a cathedral built for ghosts, all glittering chandeliers and polished floors reflecting nothing but empty space, and the two of them standing at opposite ends of a vast golden vacuum. The candles continued to burn in their sconces, indifferent to the absence of witnesses, and somewhere in the distance Darlena could hear the muffled sounds of displaced guests settling into the gardens, their voices carrying on the winter air like echoes from another world. Scott turned to face her, and in the sudden stillness his expression was unreadable, somewhere between determination and something that looked almost like fear, as though he too was standing on the edge of a precipice and had just chosen to jump. "Now," he said quietly, crossing the empty ballroom toward her with measured steps that seemed to echo in the silence. "Will you dance with me, Miss Thelma? Without an audience, without judgment, without anyone waiting for you to stumble except me, and I promise you, I have no such expectations." Darlena's legs felt like water as she stood, her sketchbook slipping from nerveless fingers to land on the bench behind her. The empty ballroom stretched around them like a world unto itself, and she felt simultaneously exposed and protected, as though Scott had built a fortress around her by the simple act of removing everyone else. Her hands trembled as she smoothed her blue silk gown, a gesture born more of habit than necessity, and when she looked up at him standing in the center of that vast golden space, she saw Patience's face, and something else, something that looked like understanding so profound it hurt to witness. "There's no music," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, grasping for any excuse that might save her from this terrifying moment of visibility. Scott's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile, but held warmth nonetheless. "Then we'll make our own," he said, extending his hand toward her across the space between them. "Unless you prefer I sing, though I should warn you that 5 years in monasteries did nothing to improve my voice." The absurdity of it. The image of the Duke of Somerton singing off-key in an empty ballroom broke something loose in Darlena's chest, and she felt a sound escape her that might have been a laugh or might have been a sob or might have been both at once. She took a step toward him, then another, each movement feeling like crossing a continent, and when she finally placed her trembling hand in his, she felt the warmth of his palm against hers like a benediction. Scott drew her gently into position, his right hand settling at her waist with a touch so careful it felt reverent, and Darlena placed her left hand on his shoulder with fingers that shook despite her best efforts to steady them. They stood like that for a long moment, not moving, and Darlena could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears, could feel the years of armor she built threatening to crack completely under the weight of this impossible kindness. "I don't remember how," she whispered, her voice breaking. "It's been so long, I don't remember the steps." "Then follow me," Scott said simply, and began to move. There was no counting, no rigid adherence to form or pattern. He simply moved, and she moved with him, a slow swaying that gradually found its own rhythm in the silence. Scott hummed quietly, a melody that was neither waltz nor country dance, but something older, simpler, a tune that seemed to come from the same ancient places he had visited during his exile. Darlena felt her body begin to remember things her mind had tried to forget, the way one foot followed another, the way her weight could shift in balance, the way two people could move together as though they had always known how. The empty ballroom became their entire world. The chandeliers above threw golden light across the polished floor, and their shadows moved with them, elongated and graceful in ways that Darlena had forgotten she could be. She stumbled once, her foot catching on the hem of her gown, and her entire body tense, waiting for judgment, for laughter, for confirmation of every cruel thing she believed about herself. But Scott simply adjusted his grip, steadying her with easy strength, and continued moving as though nothing had happened, as though her stumble was simply part of the dance rather than proof of her unworthiness. Tears began to slip down Darlena's cheeks, silent and unstoppable, years of suppressed grief and longing finally finding release. Scott didn't comment on them, didn't pause or offer empty comfort. He simply continued to guide her through their private waltz, his hand steady at her waist, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that felt like being truly seen for the first time in her life. "You cleared an entire ballroom for me," Darlena said, her voice thick with tears. "You sent away everyone, all of society, just so I could dance without being watched." "No," Scott said quietly, spinning her gently beneath the chandeliers. "I sent them away so you could dance while being seen. There's a difference. You've been invisible for 3 years, Miss Thelma. I wanted you to know what it felt like to be the only person who mattered in a room." And in that moment, swaying in the arms of a duke who had banished the world for her, Darlena felt the last of her ice shatter completely, felt her soul reclaim space that had surrendered to fear and shame, felt herself become whole in ways she had thought impossible. The dance continued, timeless and healing. Two exiles finding home in the center of an empty ballroom on a winter night, when the world had briefly stopped demanding to be anything other than exactly who they were. By dawn on Christmas morning, the story of the empty ballroom had spread through the county like wildfire through summer grass. Darlena sat in the morning room of her aunt's house, a cup of untouched tea growing cold in her hands, while Margaret perched on the settee recounting the gossip she had already collected from 3 separate morning callers. The Ton had dissected every moment of the previous evening with surgical precision, and the verdict was apparently unanimous in its scandal. Lady Pemberton says it was the most extraordinary breach of propriety she's witnessed in 40 years, Margaret reported, her eyes bright with a mixture of concern and excitement. And Mrs. Cavendish told Mother that the Duke has clearly been affected by his years abroad, that foreign travel has made him forget proper English behavior. But Darlena, she leaned forward, lowering her voice conspiratorially. Lord Whitmore told me that half the gentlemen present were secretly impressed, and several of the younger ladies have declared it the most romantic gesture they've ever witnessed. Darlena set down her teacup with hands that were steadier than they had been in years. She had slept little, her mind replaying the dance in Scott's arms, the feeling of being seen rather than scrutinized, the weight of his certainty that she was worthy of such a gesture. Part of her waited for the familiar shame to creep in, for the voice that told her she had once again made herself a spectacle. But it did not come. Instead, she felt something dangerously close to peace. The door burst open, and their aunt swept in, her face flushed with agitation. Darlena, you must prepare yourself. Lady Isabella has called, and is asking to see you specifically. I tried to turn her away, but she was quite insistent. Darlena's peace evaporated, replaced by the old familiar dread. She rose slowly, smoothing her morning dress, and nodded. Show her in. It's better to face whatever cruelty she's prepared than to hide from it. Lady Isabella entered like a ship under full sail, her elegant morning gown rustling with each purposeful step, her expression carrying that particular smile that preceded her most devastating attacks. Miss Thelma, she said, her voice dripping false sweetness. How extraordinary that you become the talk of the entire county. Though I suppose any attention is better than none for someone in your position. Before Darlena could formulate a response, a deeper voice cut to the tension like a knife through silk. Lady Isabella, how convenient that I find you here. Scott Williams stood in the doorway, still in his riding clothes, his dark hair slightly windswept, and his presence filled the morning room with an authority that made Lady Isabella's grandeur seem suddenly petty and small. He must have ridden directly from Thornhill Manor, and Darlena's heart stuttered at the implication that he had come for her, that last night had not been an isolated gesture born of momentary compassion. Your Grace, Lady Isabella said, recovering her composure with practiced ease. I was just discussing with Miss Thelma the rather unusual events of last evening. Were you? Scott moved into the room with the same quiet confidence he had shown when clearing the ballroom, and Darlena watched Lady Isabella's smile falter as he positioned himself between them, a deliberate barrier. Then allow me to clarify those events, so there could be no confusion about my intentions or Miss Thelma's character. He turned to face Lady Isabella fully, and his voice, when he spoke, carried across the room with the weight of absolute conviction. Last night, I had the privilege of dancing with the most honest woman in that ballroom, a woman who has endured 3 years of cruelty and gossip with dignity that would shame most of the so-called paragons of society. I cleared that hall not because Miss Thelma is unworthy of public attention, but because the public has proven itself unworthy of her. Lady Isabella's face had gone pale, then flushed with anger. Your Grace, surely you cannot mean to suggest. I mean to suggest nothing, Scott interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. I am stating plainly that any person who chooses to speak ill of Miss Thelma in my hearing will find themselves unwelcome at Thornhill Manor and any estate under my influence. I am announcing my intention to court her properly, with all the respect and attention she has been so shamefully denied. And I am making it clear that anyone who has used her past to justify present cruelty should examine their own character before casting further stones. The silence that followed was absolute. Lady Isabella stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing like a landed fish, while Margaret's hand flew to cover her own mouth in shock. Darlena felt tears burning behind her eyes again, but these were different from last night's catharsis. These were tears of recognition, of understanding that Scott's gesture had not been temporary madness, but the beginning of something that might actually heal her. Now, Scott said, turning to Darlena with an expression that softened from iron to warmth, If you would do me the honor, Miss Thelma, I'd like to take you riding this afternoon. I find I've had quite enough of sitting rooms and social calls. February 14th, 1815, and the late morning light streamed through the tall windows of the bridal suite at Thornhill Manor, casting ribbons of gold across the ivory silk of Darlena's wedding gown. She stood before the mirror, but this time when she looked at her reflection, she did not see the ice lady or the ruined woman or the ghost who had haunted ballroom corners for 3 years. She saw herself, simply herself, eyes bright with something that looked suspiciously like joy, cheeks flushed with anticipation rather than shame, and she marveled at how much could change in the space of 2 months. The winter courtship had been swift and tender, a succession of morning rides through snow-covered fields, quiet evenings in the library at Thornhill Manor discussing philosophy and art, stolen moments in gardens where Scott had kissed her for the first time beneath a bare oak tree and told her she was the bravest person he had ever met. He had been relentless in his public devotion, appearing at her side at every gathering, dancing with her at every ball, his presence a shield against the whispers that had gradually transformed from cruel mockery to grudging acceptance to something that almost resembled approval. Lady Isabella had left for Bath after their confrontation and had not returned. The Tun had adjusted its narrative, as it always did when faced with power that refused to bend. And now the story of the Enby Ballroom was told not as scandal, but as legend, a duke's romantic gesture that eclipsed even the most extravagant fairy tales. Margaret burst into the room, radiant in her rose-colored bridesmaid gown, carrying a bouquet of white roses and early spring violets that perfumed the air with the promise of renewal. "Oh, Darlena," she breathed, her eyes filling with happy tears. "You look absolutely beautiful." Scott is downstairs pacing like a caged lion, and Lord Ravenscroft says he's never seen a man so eager to reach the altar. Darlena took the bouquet with trembling hands, feeling the soft petals against her fingers, and thought of all the flowers that had died during her 3-year winter, all the beauty she had refused to let herself feel, because feeling anything meant risking further pain. But Scott had taught her that the opposite of pain was not numbness, but courage, the willingness to be vulnerable again, even when every instinct screamed for self-protection. The chapel at Thornhill Manor was smaller than the grand ballroom where they had first danced, but it was filled with light and flowers and people, so many people, their faces turning toward her as she appeared at the entrance on her uncle's arm. For a moment, the old panic threatened to surface, the awareness of being watched and judged, but then she found Scott standing at the altar, his dark eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made the rest of the room fade into insignificance. He was smiling, not the polite social smile she had seen him deploy with others, but the real smile she had learned to recognize during their courtship, the one that made the corners of his eyes crease and transformed his entire face into something that looked like home. And Darlena realized with startling clarity that she no longer needed the room to be empty to feel safe, because Scott had taught her that true safety came not from hiding, but from being seen by someone who looked at her brokenness and found beauty there. She walked down the flower-strewn aisle with steady steps, her head held high, meeting the eyes of guests who had once whispered about her ruin and now witnessed her redemption. Margaret followed behind, and the small orchestra played a gentle processional that filled the chapel with music. But Darlena heard only the thunder of her own heart and the silent promise in Scott's eyes that said she would never have to dance alone again.